The sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden platform, and Isabelle Renaud knew this moment would define whether she lived or died. She stood there, her wrists bound with rough rope that had already torn the skin raw. Her dress, once a pale blue cotton that her mother had sewn, now hung in tatters, stained with dirt and blood. Around her, the chaos of Fort Griffin's trading post roared like a living beast. Men shouting, horses neighing, the smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies thick in the desert air. This was 1878, the edge of the American frontier, where civilization frayed into something darker, something primal. Isabelle's story had begun 3 weeks earlier in a moment of shattering violence. She had been traveling with a small wagon train. Families seeking new lives in Texas, dreamers and desperate souls alike. Her father had died the previous winter, her mother just months ago from fever. At 23 years old, Isabelle had nothing left but her skill with needle and thread, and a stubborn will to survive that burned like embers in her chest. The raid came at dawn. She remembered the sound first, the thunder of hooves that shook the earth, then the screaming. Outlaws, they said later, men who'd abandoned all pretense of humanity, who saw the frontier as a place where rules dissolved like morning mist. They took everything, supplies, horses, lives, and they took her. The journey to Fort Griffin had been a blur of pain and terror. Days tied to a saddle, nights spent shivering in makeshift camps, while her captors drank and argued over what price she might fetch. One of them, a scarred man with tobacco-stained teeth, kept saying she'd be worth more in Mexico. Another insisted the fort's auction would bring quick money. In the end, greed and impatience won. Now she stood on this platform, and a man with a voice like gravel was calling out her attributes as if she were livestock. "Fine hands," he shouted. "Educated. Can sew, can mend, knows her letters." Each word felt like a nail driven into her dignity. But Isabelle had learned something in these weeks of horror. She had learned that pride was a luxury and survival. Survival required calculation. The crowd before her was a study in frontier brutality. Traders in dusty suits, their eyes cold and appraising. Ranch owners looking for cheap labor. And worse, men whose intentions made her stomach turn, whose leering gazes stripped away what little protection her tattered dress provided. The bidding started low, too low. The auctioneer's assistant, a young soldier who couldn't meet her eyes, shifted uncomfortably. Isabelle's mind raced. She had seen what happened to women who went for bottom prices, seen the bruises on other captives, heard the stories whispered in the darkness. She had one chance, one. She drew herself up, ignoring the pain in her shoulders, the exhaustion threatening to buckle her knees, and she spoke. "I can make a man wealthy," she called out, her voice carrying across the crowd with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Fine garments. Frontier survival. I know herbs, I know healing." And though she paused, letting the lie form on her lips, sweet and terrible, "I come from strong stock, bearing sons." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, laughter, harsh, mocking laughter from the men who saw her as nothing more than merchandise. But some looked again, reconsidered. The bidding climbed, and with it Isabelle's terror. A ranch owner in a leather vest, a trader with calculating eyes, and then a man who made her breath catch. He pushed through the crowd like water parting around stone, and the laughter died. He was tall, his skin bronzed by sun and heritage, his hair long and black, bound with leather cord. He wore buckskin and beadwork, but it was his eyes that held her, dark eyes that had seen loss, that carried the weight of 1,000 sorrows, eyes that, somehow, saw her. The crowd's mood shifted instantly. Whispers hissed through the assembly like rattlesnakes. Comanche. Savage. What's he doing here with coin? The hostility was palpable, a living thing that threatened to explode into violence at any moment. But the man, later she would learn his name was Grey Eagle, simply stood there unmoved as bedrock. When he spoke, his English was perfect, measured. "I will pay in gold." He held up a leather pouch, and the metallic clink silenced the muttering. The auctioneer's eyes widened. Gold was rare on this frontier. Most dealt in barter and credit. This changed everything. The bidding became a battle. The ranch owner's face reddened with rage. The trader spat curses. But Grey Eagle simply raised the stakes again and again, his expression never changing. Isabel watched this stranger, this man the crowd feared and hated, spend what must have been a fortune. For her, why? Finally, inevitably, the hammer fell. Sold! The word echoed across the platform, sealing her fate. As the auctioneer counted the gold coins, a colonel in Union blue approached, his weathered face showing something unexpected, respect. He looked at Isabel directly and asked a question no one else had thought to ask. Girl, is this your choice? The question hung in the air like a lifeline thrown across an abyss. Isabel looked at Grey Eagle, at the crowd of hostile white men whose intentions she knew, at the colonel who had offered her perhaps the only moment of agency she would ever have. Her answer came from somewhere deep, somewhere instinctual. Yes, the colonel nodded. Turn to Grey Eagle. Keep her safe or answer to me. It was more than most would have done, more than the law required. It was something. As the crowd dispersed, muttering and spitting, Grey Eagle approached the platform. Up close, Isabel could see the lines around his eyes, the scars on his hands. The mark of a man who had lived. He cut her bonds with a knife that gleamed in the sunlight. And as the rope fell away, Isabel felt something shift. Not freedom, not yet, but possibility. He spoke softly, words meant only for her. Can you ride? She nodded, though her legs shook. He offered his hand, calloused, steady, and helped her down. The crowd parted reluctantly, hatred burning in their eyes. But they parted. 2 horses waited at the edge of the fort. Grey Eagle's mount was a magnificent paint stallion, and beside it a smaller mare already saddled. He had planned this, prepared for her. The realization sent a shiver through Isabel's exhausted body. As he helped her onto the mare, his touch was careful, respectful. Nothing like the rough hands that had dragged her here. They rode out of Fort Griffin as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. And with every step, Isabel felt the weight of eyes upon them, watching, judging, hating. The frontier was a place of hard lines and harder men, and she had just crossed a boundary that most considered unforgivable. Behind them, the fort grew smaller. Ahead, the vast Texas prairie stretched endlessly, grass rippling like an ocean of gold in the fading light, and Isabel Renaud understood, with absolute clarity, that she had just traded one kind of captivity for something entirely unknown, something that terrified her almost as much as it gave her hope. The prairie at twilight was a world unto itself, and Isabel had never felt so small, so utterly vulnerable, as she did riding beside this silent stranger into the deepening dusk. Grey Eagle set a steady pace, neither rushing nor dawdling, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape with the practiced awareness of someone who had learned to read danger in every shadow. Isabel clung to the mare's mane, her body screaming with exhaustion, every muscle protesting the movement. She had not ridden in weeks, had not been allowed to ride, only tied and dragged. Now, astride this gentle horse, she felt the bitter irony of being given freedom precisely when she was too broken to enjoy it. The sun disappeared behind them, painting the sky in shades of crimson and violet, colors so beautiful they seemed impossible after the ugliness of the day. They rode for perhaps 2 hours before Grey Eagle finally raised his hand, signaling a stop. They had reached a small depression in the land, where a cluster of mesquite trees offered shelter and a thin trickle of water ran over smooth stones. A camp. Carefully chosen, defensible, hidden from casual eyes, Isabel nearly fell from the saddle. Her legs gave out as her feet touched ground, and she would have collapsed if Grey Eagle hadn't moved with startling speed to catch her. For a moment they stood there, his hands steadying her shoulders, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Then he released her, stepped back, gave her space. It was the first of many small mercies she would come to recognize. "Sit," he said simply, gesturing to a flat rock near the water. "Rest." While she collapsed onto the stone, Grey Eagle moved with quiet efficiency, building a small fire, arranging supplies. From his pack, he produced dried meat, hardtack, and something wrapped in leaves that smelled of herbs and smoke. He handed her a canteen first. Drink slowly. The water was cool and sweet, better than anything Isabel could remember tasting. She forced herself to sip, though she wanted to gulp, wanted to drown herself in the relief of it. Grey Eagle watched her with those dark, inscrutable eyes. And then he spoke again, his voice low and measured. "You are afraid." It wasn't a question. Isabel nodded, seeing no point in lies. The firelight cast dancing shadows across his face, and she realized he was younger than she had first thought. Perhaps 30, perhaps less, but his eyes were ancient. "Good," he continued. "Fear keeps you alive on the frontier. But know this," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "I mean you no harm. You owe me nothing. Not your body, not your service, only truth." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward through Isabel's consciousness. She had expected demands, expected immediate enforcement of what he had purchased. Instead, this strange promise that felt too good to be real. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why spend gold on me? Why risk what you risked back there? Grey Eagle poked at the fire, sparks rising into the darkening sky. When he answered, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "My wife died 2 winters ago, in childbirth. The baby, my son, lived only hours." He paused, and Isabel saw his jaw tighten. Her name was Morning Star. She was everything. When she died, I made a promise to her spirit, that I would find hope again, that I would not let grief consume me, as it has consumed so many of our warriors. The confession hung between them, raw and unexpected. Isabel felt tears prick her eyes. Tears for this stranger's loss, yes, but also tears for her own, for her parents, for the life she had known, for the girl she had been before the world taught her that safety was an illusion. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For your loss?" Grey Eagle nodded, accepting the condolence. Then he looked at her directly, his gaze penetrating. "At the auction, you spoke of bearing sons. Was it truth?" Isabel's breath caught. Here was the moment, the reckoning. She could lie, could try to maintain the desperate fiction she had created to survive. But something in his eyes, in the way he had spoken of his wife, in the careful respect he had shown, something demanded honesty. "No," she said, the word barely audible above the crackling fire. "It was a lie, a desperate one. I said what I thought would make me valuable enough to avoid." She couldn't finish, didn't need to. Grey Eagle understood. The silence stretched between them, and Isabel braced for anger, for the fury of a man who had spent gold on false promises. Instead, Grey Eagle laughed. It was a short, bitter sound, but not directed at her. "I thought as much. A woman facing the auction block will say whatever keeps her alive." He stirred the fire again. "I did not buy you for sons, Isabel Renaud. I bought you because I saw something in your eyes. Strength, will, the same fire that burned in Morning Star. And because—" He paused. "Because in that moment, I understood what it meant to be sold. To be judged by those who see you as less than human." The understanding crashed over Isabel like a wave. He knew what it was to stand before hostile eyes, to be reduced to a commodity, to have your humanity questioned by those who thought themselves superior. His people, the Comanche, had been pushed, hunted, forced onto reservations or into hiding. He lived in a world that wanted him dead or domesticated. And in her, on that platform, he had seen a reflection of his own struggle. "Can you truly sew?" he asked, changing the subject with characteristic directness. Isabel nodded, grateful for the shift. "Yes, my mother was a seamstress in New Orleans before we came west. She taught me everything. Fine work, practical work. I can mend, I can create. It's the one skill I have that's worth anything out here." Grey Eagle considered this. "Good. Winter comes hard on the prairie. If we are to survive, we will need every skill we possess." The casual use of "we" did not escape Isabel's notice. Not I and you, we, as if they were partners in this strange arrangement, not master and purchased woman. It was disorienting, hopeful, terrifying. That night, Grey Eagle set up a simple camp. He gave Isabel a bedroll, positioned carefully on the opposite side of the fire from his own. He showed her where he would sleep, where the horses were tethered, where the water ran. "If danger comes," he said, "wake me. Do not try to face it alone." Then he handed her a knife, a small blade in a leather sheath. "For your protection. Not from me, but the prairie has many dangers." Isabel took the knife with shaking hands. To be armed, to be trusted with a weapon. It was more than she had dared hope. She tucked it into her belt, feeling its weight like an anchor. As darkness fell completely, bringing with it the vast canopy of stars that stretched from horizon to horizon, Isabel lay on her bedroll and listened to the sounds of the night. Crickets singing, wind whispering through grass, the soft breathing of horses, and beyond all that, the profound silence of the frontier. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by nightmares and sudden wakefulness. But each time she jolted awake, heart pounding, she saw Grey Eagle's silhouette across the fire, standing watch, keeping guard, keeping his unspoken promise of protection. And slowly, impossibly, Isabel began to understand that perhaps, just perhaps, she had been saved rather than sold. Morning came with birdsong and the smell of coffee brewing over the rekindled fire. Grey Eagle was already up, tending to the horses, checking their route. When Isabel emerged from her bedroll, stiff and sore, he handed her a tin cup of the dark, bitter brew. "We ride north," he said. "To my camp. 3 days' journey if the weather holds." He paused, studying her carefully. "Can you make it?" Isabel straightened her spine, forcing strength into legs that felt like water. Yes, she would make it. She had no choice. But more than that, she found herself wanting to make it, wanting to see what lay ahead, what this strange new chapter of her life might hold. Grey Eagle nodded, satisfied, and began breaking camp with practiced efficiency. As they mounted their horses and turned northward, the sun climbing higher in an impossibly blue sky, Isabel realized that she was riding towards something rather than fleeing from something. It was a subtle distinction, but on the frontier, where the line between life and death was razor-thin, subtle distinctions could mean everything. The journey north unfolded like a slow revelation, each mile stripping away another layer of Isabel's assumptions about the man who rode silently beside her, and about the vast, unforgiving landscape they traversed. Grey Eagle moved through the prairie like a ghost, reading signs in bent grass and disturbed earth that Isabel couldn't even perceive. He pointed out edible plants, showed her where water pooled in hidden depressions, taught her the basics of frontier survival with a patience that surprised her. "That grass," he would say, gesturing to a particular patch, "water beneath. Remember the color," or "see how the hawks circle. Carrion below. Death we avoid." Each lesson was delivered in the same measured tone, neither condescending nor rushed. He treated her as someone capable of learning, capable of becoming something more than what she had been. And Isabel found herself absorbing everything with desperate hunger. This was survival. This was freedom. The freedom to understand the land, to exist within it rather than in spite of it. On the second day, they encountered other travelers. A small group of traders heading south, their wagons loaded with furs and supplies. Grey Eagle tensed immediately, his hand moving to the rifle strapped to his saddle. But he didn't run, didn't hide. Instead, he guided them to a path that would cross the traders at a distance. Close enough for acknowledgement, far enough to prevent confrontation. As they passed, Isabel saw the traders' reactions: suspicion, fear. One man spat on the ground, a gesture of contempt, but they did not attack, did not challenge. Perhaps because Grey Eagle rode with quiet confidence, his weapons visible, his bearing that of a man who would not be easily overcome. Or perhaps because they saw Isabel beside him and made their own calculations about the cost of violence. Either way, they passed without incident. "They will talk," Grey Eagle said once the traders were distant specks on the horizon. "Word will spread that I have taken a white woman north. Some will call it kidnapping. Others will understand the truth of the auction. But either way," he looked at her seriously, "we will be hunted. Sooner or later, men will come seeking either you or the bounty on my head. Or both." The statement sent ice through Isabel's veins. She had known this abstractly, had understood that their arrangement defied the brutal social codes of the frontier. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real. "What do we do?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Grey Eagle's expression softened slightly. "We survive together, as Morning Star's people say. 2 arrows are harder to break than 1. That night, camping in a small canyon where the walls provided shelter from wind and watching eyes, Grey Eagle began teaching Isabel more actively how to build a fire that produced minimal smoke, how to listen for the approach of riders, how to move quietly, disturbing the land as little as possible. Each skill was a gift, a piece of knowledge that transformed her from victim to participant in her own survival. And as the firelight played across his features, Isabel found herself studying this man who had so dramatically altered her fate. His hands, scarred and capable, moving with practiced grace as he demonstrated knots and snares. His voice, low and steady, never impatient when she failed to grasp something immediately. His respect for her, evident in every interaction, every careful maintenance of distance, every question asked rather than commanded. "Why do you teach me these things?" she asked during a quiet moment, the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient dance. Grey Eagle looked up from the leather strap he was repairing. "Because dependency is another form of captivity. If you rely on me for everything, you are still a prisoner. I want," he paused, choosing words carefully, "I want partnership, equal contribution, different skills perhaps, but equal value." The concept was radical. Isabel had been raised in a world where women's roles were strictly defined, where men provided and women maintained, where the frontier amplified traditional hierarchies until they became absolute. But Grey Eagle spoke of something different, something that acknowledged her humanity, her potential, her right to agency in determining her own fate. On the 3rd morning they reached the valley. Isabel saw nothing at first. Just more rolling prairie, more grass and sky. But Grey Eagle led them to what appeared to be an unremarkable depression in the land. And then suddenly, the ground dropped away into a hidden canyon that took her breath away. The valley was perhaps 1/2 mile wide, enclosed by steep walls of red-brown stone that would be nearly impossible to scale without ropes and determination. A stream ran through its center, bordered by cottonwood trees, whose leaves whispered secrets in the morning breeze. And there, nestled against the far wall where the stone created natural shelter, was a camp. Not temporary, not makeshift. A dwelling, sturdy structures built from stone and wood, weatherproofed and carefully positioned. "This is home," Grey Eagle said simply, but Isabel heard the pride in his voice. "The love. I have spent 2 years building this place, storing supplies, creating something that could withstand winter, withstand isolation, withstand—" He trailed off, but Isabel understood. "Withstand the world that wanted him erased." They descended into the valley via a narrow trail that switched back down the stone face, the horses picking their way with careful steps. Up close, the camp was even more impressive. Grey Eagle had built a main shelter from stone and timber, its roof thatched with grass and sealed with mud and pitch. Inside was dim but dry, with a fire pit already laid. Furs and blankets arranged for sleeping, storage areas built into the stone walls themselves. Adjacent to the main shelter was a smaller structure, a smokehouse, Isabel realized, for preserving meat through the long winter. And beyond that, a carefully tended area where herbs and wild plants had been transplanted, creating a small garden of medicinal and edible species. Water barrels caught runoff from the stream. Animal traps hung from branches, ready to be deployed. This was not survival. This was civilization, built by one man's hands, one man's determination to create something enduring. "It's remarkable," Isabel breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. Grey Eagle shrugged, but she saw pleasure in his expression. "It is enough. With your skills added to mine, with someone to share the labor and the planning, it can become more. But first," he gestured to a partitioned area within the main shelter, "you need rest, real rest. Time to heal." The partitioned space was simple but private, separated by a hanging deerskin that could be tied back or closed for privacy. A sleeping platform raised off the cold earth, covered with furs. A small shelf carved into the stone for personal belongings. It was the first space in weeks that Isabel could call her own. The realization made tears spring to her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. Grey Eagle noticed, as he seemed to notice everything, but he said nothing, simply stepped back, giving her space to process. "Take today to rest," he said. "Tomorrow, if you are able, I will show you how everything works. The water system, the storage, the snares, all of it. This valley will keep us safe, but only if we both understand how to use it." That day, Isabel slept, truly slept, for the first time in longer than she could remember. She slept through the afternoon, waking occasionally to the sound of Grey Eagle working outside, the rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting wood, the splash of water being carried from the stream, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to the horses. Ordinary sounds, peaceful sounds. When she finally emerged, the sun was setting, painting the valley walls in shades of orange and gold. Grey Eagle had prepared a meal. Rabbit roasted over the fire, wild onions and roots cooked in the coals, acorn bread that crumbled sweetly on her tongue. They ate in companionable silence, the day's work settling around them like a comfortable blanket. "Tell me about New Orleans," Grey Eagle said eventually, his voice cutting through the cricket song. "Tell me about your life before." And so Isabel did. She told him about the narrow streets of the French Quarter, about her mother's shop where wealthy women came for fine dresses and intricate alterations. She told him about learning to sew by candlelight. Her fingers pricked bloody as she mastered stitches so small they were nearly invisible. She told him about her father, a dreamer who believed the frontier held opportunity, who convinced her mother to abandon their established life for the promise of land and freedom. And she told him about the fever that took her mother, the grief that followed, the determination to honor her parents' dream even as it crumbled around her. Grey Eagle listened without interruption, his eyes reflecting firelight and something else. Understanding, perhaps, recognition of shared loss. When she finished, the night had deepened around them. Grey Eagle added wood to the fire, the flames leaping higher. "My people tell stories by firelight," he said. "Stories of how the world came to be, stories of heroes and tricksters, stories that carry the wisdom of generations. Your story, Isabel Renaud, is now part of that tradition, part of this valley's memory. And tomorrow," he smiled, a rare expression that transformed his serious features, "we begin writing the next chapter." And Isabel, sitting in this hidden valley at the edge of the world, felt something she hadn't felt since before the raid, hope, fragile as new grass, but growing toward light. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing, and Isabel discovered that survival, when shared with purpose, could become something close to living. Grey Eagle was true to his word. Each morning began with lessons. He taught her to set snares for rabbits and prairie chickens, showing her how to read animal trails and position the loops where prey would naturally step. He demonstrated how to preserve meat using smoke and salt, how to tan hides until they were supple enough for clothing, how to identify which plants could heal and which could kill. In return, Isabel contributed skills that transformed their existence from mere survival to something more refined. She took inventory of Grey Eagle's supplies and began organizing them with systematic efficiency. The jumble of dried herbs became labeled pouches sorted by use. The pile of damaged clothing and torn blankets became a mending project that she attacked with needle and thread salvaged from her own torn dress. "You carry organization like a weapon," Grey Eagle observed one afternoon watching her work. Isabel laughed, the sound surprising both of them. It had been so long since she had laughed. My mother used to say that chaos was the enemy of productivity. In her shop, everything had its place. Every thread, every button, every scrap of fabric. She could locate what she needed in seconds, even in the dark. Grey Eagle nodded thoughtfully. Morning Star was the same. She could navigate our camp with her eyes closed, could find any tool or supply without hesitation. The best partnerships, he paused, measuring his words, they balance each other. One person's strength covers another's weakness. Together, they create something greater than either could alone. The word partnership hung between them, weighted with meaning. They were partners, Isabel realized. Not master and servant, not captor and captive. Partners in survival, yes, but increasingly. Partners in building something, a life, a future. However uncertain, however threatened by the hostile world beyond the valley walls. As autumn deepened and the cottonwood leaves turned gold, Isabel began to truly see the genius of Grey Eagle's Valley. The steep walls blocked wind, creating a microclimate warmer than the surrounding prairie. The stream never froze completely, fed by some underground source that ran warmer than surface water. The cave-like shelter stayed comfortable even as temperatures dropped, the thick stone walls holding heat from the fire. But more than the physical advantages, the valley offered psychological refuge. Here, enclosed by stone and sky, the weight of the outside world's judgment felt distant. The hatred at Fort Griffin, the contempt of passing travelers, the bounty that surely existed on Grey Eagle's head, all of it faded to background noise. Here they could be simply two people trying to survive winter. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a day of preserving the last of the season's meat, Grey Eagle began to speak of his past. Not in the halting, painful way he had mentioned Morning Star, but with the flowing cadence of a storyteller. He told Isabel about his childhood, about learning to ride before he could walk, about his first hunt and the pride in his father's eyes. He told her about the changing world, about how the buffalo herds that had once darkened the plains for miles were disappearing, hunted to near extinction. "Our way of life is dying," he said, staring into the flames. "The reservations are prisons dressed in the language of protection. The old ways, the freedom to follow the buffalo, to live as our ancestors lived, it is ending. Men like me, we are the last. We can adapt, we can hide, we can survive in these margins. But the world that made us is gone." The grief in his voice was palpable, and Isabel felt it resonate with her own sense of displacement. "I understand," she said softly. "Perhaps not the same, but similar. My mother's New Orleans is gone too. The war changed everything. The South she knew, the traditions and certainties. They burned along with the cities. We are both refugees in a way. Both trying to build something new from the ashes of what was." Grey Eagle looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, connection, the understanding that their losses, while different in detail, were identical in impact. They had both been severed from their pasts, both cast adrift in a world that didn't want them. And they had both, against all odds, found each other. The work continued. Isabel repaired Grey Eagle's clothing, replacing torn buckskin with careful stitching, reinforcing seams that had begun to fail. She fashioned a proper dress for herself from a bolt of canvas Grey Eagle had stored, dyeing it with plant extracts until it was a muted brown that blended with the landscape. She made warm leggings from rabbit pelts, stitching them with sinew until they were snug and weatherproof. Grey Eagle, in turn, hunted and gathered with relentless efficiency. Deer meat hung smoking in the small structure. Wild turkey and sage grouse were cleaned and preserved. Roots and tubers were stored in the cool, dry spaces beneath the stone. They worked together to gather and stack firewood, preparing for the brutal cold they knew was coming. But even in this isolated valley, even in their careful preparation, danger was never far away. It came on a grey afternoon in late October, when the sky hung low and heavy with the promise of the season's first snow. Isabel was working near the stream, cleaning hides, when she heard something that made her freeze. Voices, men's voices, carrying on the wind from somewhere above the valley rim. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She abandoned the hides and ran for the main shelter, her heart hammering against her ribs. Grey Eagle was inside, working on a new arrow shaft, and he looked up sharply at her entrance. One look at her face told him everything. He moved instantly, grabbing his rifle, checking the loads with practiced speed. "How many?" he asked, his voice calm despite the urgency. "I don't know," Isabel gasped. "At least 2, maybe more. They're above the valley on the rim." Grey Eagle nodded, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. "Bounty hunters, most likely. Someone from Fort Griffin must have talked, described the direction we headed. They're searching." He moved to the shelter's entrance, peering carefully toward the valley's rim. Isabel followed, and together they watched as figures appeared silhouetted against the grey sky. 3 men on horseback, moving slowly, scanning the landscape. "Looking for a trail, looking for them. If they find the path down," Isabel began, but Grey Eagle cut her off. "They won't, not easily. That trail is hidden, unless you know where to look. And even if they find it, this valley is defensible. We have advantages." He paused, then turned to her with absolute seriousness. "But if it comes to violence, I need to know. Can you fight? Can you shoot?" Isabel had never fired a gun in her life. But she thought of the auction platform, of the men who had leered and spat, of what awaited her if these bounty hunters succeeded. She thought of this valley, this fragile sanctuary they had built together, and she made her decision. "Teach me." What followed was an intense, abbreviated lesson in survival by force. Grey Eagle showed her how to load and aim the spare rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder to absorb recoil, how to breathe and squeeze rather than jerk the trigger. "You don't need to be a marksman," he said. "You just need to make them think twice about approaching, to create doubt. Doubt is often enough." They spent the remainder of daylight preparing. Grey Eagle positioned supplies for a potential siege: water, ammunition, dried food. He showed Isabel the best defensive positions, angles that provided cover while maintaining sightlines. And all the while, they watched the rim, watched the hunters searching, circling like wolves around a hidden den. As darkness fell, the men above built a fire. They were camping, settling in for the night, probably planning to search more thoroughly in daylight. Grey Eagle's jaw tightened. They're persistent. That means the bounty is high. High enough to make them willing to risk time and resources. He looked at Isabel, his expression grave. "Tomorrow, one way or another, this ends." That night, neither slept. They took turns watching, weapons ready, every sense heightened to painful awareness. Isabel found herself thinking about how much had changed in mere weeks. The terrified woman on the auction platform would have collapsed into panic. But now she checked the rifle's load for the 3rd time, positioned herself where Grey Eagle had taught her, and felt something hard and determined settle into her chest. Resolve. Dawn came cold and grey, mist rising from the stream like ghosts, and with the light, the hunters began their descent. They had found the trail. Grey Eagle had been right. It wasn't easy to spot, but these men were professionals, experienced trackers who knew how to read the land. Isabel watched them picking their way down the narrow path, their horses stepping carefully, and her breath came short and shallow. "Positions," Grey Eagle said quietly, and Isabel moved to the spot they had prepared. Behind a natural barrier of stone, with clear sight to the valley floor where the trail ended, Grey Eagle took position 20 feet away, his rifle trained on the approaching men. The distance between them was calculated, far enough apart that a single attack couldn't take them both, close enough to support each other. The first hunter reached the valley floor and immediately raised his rifle, scanning for targets. "Grey Eagle," he shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "We know you're here. We've got no quarrel with you. We just want the girl. Turn her over, and we'll ride out peaceful." The lie was transparent. Bounty hunters didn't leave witnesses, didn't leave anyone who could identify them or testify about their methods. Grey Eagle didn't even bother responding. He simply waited, his rifle steady, his breathing controlled. Isabel tried to match his calm, though her heart felt like it might burst from her chest. The second and third hunters descended, spreading out as they reached the valley floor. Professional, coordinated, they had done this before. "Last chance," the leader called out. "Don't die for some whore you bought at auction. She's not worth—" The shot rang out before he could finish. Grey Eagle's bullet struck the ground inches from the leader's feet, sending up a spray of dirt and stone. The message was clear, unmistakable. The hunter cursed, diving for cover. And suddenly the valley erupted with gunfire. Isabel fired her rifle, the recoil slamming into her shoulder hard enough to bruise. She had no idea if she hit anything, but Grey Eagle's training proved sound. The act of shooting, of fighting back, transformed her from victim to participant. The hunters returned fire, bullets singing off stone, thunking into wood. Grey Eagle moved between positions with fluid grace, firing, repositioning, making himself impossible to pin down. One hunter screamed as a bullet found his leg, sending him tumbling. The leader shouted orders, trying to coordinate an advance, but the valley's geography worked against them. The steep walls created funnel points, limited their options, turned their numbers from advantage to liability. The fight lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. Smoke hung in the air, mixing with morning mist. The acrid smell of gunpowder burned Isabel's nose and throat. Her ears rang from the repeated blasts, but gradually, the hunter's fire slowed, stopped. The wounded man had been dragged to cover. The others crouched behind rocks and fallen logs, reassessing. "This isn't worth it," one of them shouted. "The bounty's not worth dying in this damn valley." The leader argued, but his voice carried uncertainty now. Doubt, just as Grey Eagle had predicted. They had expected an easy capture, an unprepared target. Instead, they had found a fortified position and two people willing to defend it to the death. The standoff continued through mid-morning. Neither side fired, but neither side surrendered. The wounded hunter's groans carried across the valley, a reminder of the cost of violence. Finally, reluctantly, the leader called out again. "We're leaving!" "But this isn't over. Every hunter between here and Canada will know where you are." Grey Eagle's response was cold and final. "Let them come. They'll bleed the same." The hunters retreated, carrying their wounded companion, struggling back up the narrow trail. It took them the better part of an hour to clear the valley, and even then, Grey Eagle didn't relax. They watched until the men were distant specks on the prairie, and even then, Grey Eagle's expression remained grim. "He was right," Grey Eagle said quietly. "This valley is no longer safe." "They'll talk. Others will come, better prepared, in greater numbers. We bought ourselves time, but not safety." Isabel's hands were shaking now, adrenaline fading into exhaustion. "What do we do?" Grey Eagle was silent for a long moment, staring at the valley that had been his sanctuary, his hope for the future. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of difficult decision. "We go north, to Canada. It's the only place where American bounties don't reach, where we might find peace." The plan was audacious, suicidal even. The journey north would take them through hostile territory, through the teeth of approaching winter, through lands where neither of them had allies. But staying meant eventual death or capture. At least fleeing north offered possibility. Preparation for flight consumed them with urgent necessity, and every moment they remained in the valley felt like borrowed time ticking toward its inevitable end. Grey Eagle became a man transformed, his earlier patience replaced with focused intensity. He selected only essential supplies, weighing every item for its balance between utility and portability. "We carry what keeps us alive," he said, setting aside tools and comforts he had accumulated over years. "Everything else stays behind." Isabel worked alongside him, her newly learned skills suddenly critical. She packed food supplies with careful calculation. Dried meat, hardtack, cornmeal sealed in waterproof pouches. She reinforced their cold-weather clothing, adding extra layers of fur, testing every seam for weakness. She rolled blankets tight and secured them with leather straps. creating compact bundles that could be tied to saddles. They worked through the night, sleeping in brief shifts, always listening for the sound of approaching riders. The valley that had felt so secure now felt like a trap. The steep walls that had offered protection now seemed like prison bars, limiting escape routes. Every shadow could hide enemies. Every sound could herald attack. On the second day after the fight, Grey Eagle made a decision that spoke volumes about how far they had come. He entered Isabel's partitioned sleeping area, something he had never done without invitation, and sat across from her with ceremonial gravity. From a leather pouch, he withdrew red ochre powder and a small brush made from animal hair. "Among my people," he said, his voice formal, carrying weight, "marriage is a bond of protection and partnership. It is marked with symbols that tell others, this person is not alone. This person has someone who will defend them, fight for them, die for them." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "I would mark you, Isabel Renaud, not as property, but as wife, as equal, as the partner you have proven yourself to be." The proposal was so unexpected, so contrary to every assumption Isabel had made about their arrangement, that she simply stared. Grey Eagle continued, his words coming faster now, as if he needed to explain before she could refuse. "It is practical, yes. If we are caught, if we are questioned, marriage provides protection of a sort. But it is also truth. We have built something together, trust, respect, shared purpose. Is that not the foundation of all true partnerships?" Isabel's mind raced. This was not the marriage her mother had dreamed of for her. No church, no white dress, no celebration. But her mother's world was dead, burned away by war and displacement and the brutal realities of frontier life. What Grey Eagle offered was something different, something that acknowledged who she had become rather than who she had been. "Yes," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. "Yes, I will be your wife, your partner, your equal." Grey Eagle's hand trembled slightly as he dipped the brush in ochre mixed with water. He painted symbols on her forehead, her cheeks, her hands, geometric patterns that carried meanings Isabel didn't fully understand but felt in her bones. Protection, belonging, connection. When he finished, he painted the same symbols on his own skin, marking himself as marked her. "By the spirits of my ancestors," he said, his voice carrying the cadence of ritual. "By the memory of Morning Star who taught me about love. By the land that has sheltered us and the sky that witnesses us. I name you my wife, my partner, my hope." Isabel touched the ochre on her cheeks, feeling its dry texture. "By the memory of my parents," she said, improvising her own vow. "By the skills my mother taught me and the courage my father showed me. By everything we have survived and everything we will face. I name you my husband, my teacher, my home." The moment hung between them, sacred and strange, binding them with ties that transcended law or convention. Then Grey Eagle did something he had never done before. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently, his lips warm against the ochre symbols. "We will survive this, Isabel. Together, we will endure." That night, they shared the sleeping space for the first time, lying close for warmth and comfort and the simple reassurance of another person's presence. No passion, no expectation beyond companionship. But Isabel felt something shift nonetheless, felt the last walls of her fear crumble into trust. Grey Eagle's breathing deepened into sleep, and she lay there listening, marveling at the strange path that had led her to this moment. They left the valley at dawn on the fourth day, riding north under a sky heavy with approaching weather. Behind them, everything Grey Eagle had built remained. The stone shelter, the carefully tended garden, the tools and stores that represented years of labor. It hurt to abandon it, Isabel saw in the set of his shoulders, in the way he paused at the valley rim for one last look. But survival demanded sacrifice. The prairie in late autumn was a study in browns and greys, the grass dried to brittle stalks, the trees skeletal silhouettes against the horizon. They rode hard, pushing the horses as much as they dared, following trails that Grey Eagle seemed to sense more than see. North. Always north. Toward the distant promise of the Canadian border and whatever uncertain refuge it might offer, they passed abandoned homesteads, the dreams of failed settlers evident in collapsed soddy walls and overgrown fields. They skirted settlements where smoke rose from chimneys, places too dangerous to approach. They crossed rivers swollen with autumn rain, the horses struggling through current that tried to sweep them downstream. And through it all they watched, always watched, for pursuit, for danger, for the hunters they knew were coming. On the 6th day, the first snow fell. Light at first, just flurries that melted as they touched ground. But by evening, it was falling in earnest, thick flakes that accumulated rapidly, transforming the landscape into a white expanse that offered no shelter, no concealment. Grey Eagle's expression grew increasingly worried. "We need to find cover," he said, scanning the featureless prairie. "The horses cannot travel all night in this, and without shelter we risk freezing." But there was no shelter. No valleys, no caves, no trees substantial enough to break the wind. Just endless white stretching in every direction. Isabel felt panic rising in her chest. They had survived the auction, survived the valley fight, survived the desperate flight north. To die now, frozen in a prairie blizzard, seemed impossibly cruel. But Grey Eagle was already moving, his survival instincts asserting themselves. He dismounted, began cutting prairie grass with his knife, bundling the dried stalks. "Help me," he commanded, and Isabel obeyed without question. Together, they cut grass frantically, piling it against a small rise in the land. Grey Eagle showed her how to weave the stalks together, creating a thick mat. Then he positioned the horses as windbreaks, used their saddles and blankets to create a lean-to structure, with the grass as insulation. The shelter was crude, barely large enough for them to lie down. But it worked. Inside, protected from the wind, they huddled together for warmth, the horses standing patient vigil outside. Snow continued to fall, accumulating on the grass shelter, actually improving its insulation. Grey Eagle had saved them again, with nothing but knowledge and determination. As they lay there, pressed together in the darkness, Isabel spoke softly. "How much further to Canada?" Grey Eagle's response was honest. 3 weeks. Maybe more in winter conditions. The border is not marked clearly out here. We will know it only when we encounter trading posts flying the British flag. 3 weeks. An eternity of exposure, pursuit, danger. We'll make it, Isabel said, trying to convince herself as much as him. We've survived everything else. Grey Eagle's arm tightened around her, and she felt his chest rise and fall with deep breath. "Yes," he agreed. "We will make it. Because we must. Because the alternative is unthinkable." The blizzard lasted 2 days, trapping them in their makeshift shelter. They rationed food carefully, melted snow for water, told stories to pass the time and keep spirits up. Isabel described New Orleans in summer, the humidity and the music and the smell of beignets frying. Grey Eagle spoke of buffalo hunts, of the thunder of thousands of hooves, of the sacred relationship between hunter and prey. When the storm finally broke, the world had been transformed. Snow lay 2 feet deep in places, drifted by wind into sculptured shapes that made navigation treacherous. The horses struggled through it, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Progress slowed to a crawl, and with it their supplies dwindled at alarming rates. But they pushed on, north, always north, through days that blurred together into an endless test of endurance. Through nights so cold that water froze solid in their canteens. Through landscapes so bleak and empty that they seemed to have ridden off the edge of the known world into some Arctic purgatory. And then, on a morning when Isabel had begun to lose hope, when the cold and hunger and exhaustion had ground her down until she felt she might simply fall from her horse and never rise. Grey Eagle pointed ahead. "Look!" On the horizon, barely visible through morning mist, stood a structure, a building, and flying from a pole beside it, a red flag with a Union Jack in the corner, the British flag, the Canadian flag. They had reached the border. They had made it. Against all odds, against every reasonable expectation. They had survived. The trading post at the border was called Fort Promise, and as Isabel and Grey Eagle rode toward its weathered walls, she understood why the name felt like prophecy made manifest. The post was small, perhaps a dozen buildings arranged around a central compound, but compared to weeks of empty prairie, it looked like paradise. Smoke rose from chimneys, people moved between structures. Civilization, the very concept, felt foreign after so long in the wilderness. But Isabel found herself yearning for it with desperate intensity. As they approached, a man emerged from the main building, broad-shouldered, bearded, wearing the rough clothing of a frontier trader. He studied them with sharp eyes, taking in their exhausted horses, their weathered appearance, the ochre symbol still faintly visible on their faces despite weeks of exposure. When he spoke, his accent was Scottish, his tone carefully neutral. "Welcome to Fort Promise. You've come a long way by the looks of you." Grey Eagle dismounted slowly, his movements stiff from hours in the saddle. "We seek shelter, trade, news of whether the American hunters respect the border." The trader's expression flickered with understanding. He had seen this before, Isabel realized. Others fleeing American justice or injustice, seeking refuge in Canadian territory. "The Mounties enforce the border strictly," the trader said. "No American bounty hunters operate here without facing arrest. You're safe as any of us are on this frontier." He gestured toward the stables. "Get your horses settled. There's a room in the back of the main building. It's yours for as long as you need it." The room was small but warm, with a real bed, a stove, and walls that blocked the wind. Isabel nearly wept at the luxury of it. That night, they slept for 12 hours straight, the deep, dreamless sleep of the utterly exhausted. When they woke, the trader, his name was Duncan MacLeod, had prepared a meal of venison stew and fresh bread that tasted better than anything Isabel could remember. Over the meal, they learned about Fort Promise and the unique community that had formed around it. It was a gathering place for outcasts and refugees, for those who had fled American expansion or persecution, for native peoples displaced from their lands and white settlers who had chosen to marry them or adopt their ways. It was a sanctuary, imperfect and rough, but genuine. "You'll find no judgment here," Duncan said, refilling their bowls. "Half the folks at this post are in mixed marriages, or have bounties on their heads, or have histories they'd rather leave unexamined. We survive by respecting each other's privacy and defending each other's right to exist. It's not civilization as most define it, but it's community." In the days that followed, Isabel and Grey Eagle began to settle into this new life. Grey Eagle found work as a hunter and guide, his knowledge of the land and its animals valuable to the trading post's operations. Isabel discovered that her sewing skills were in desperately short supply. Frontier clothing wore out quickly, and there were few who knew how to repair or create garments properly. She set up a small workspace in their room, and soon found herself with more work than she could handle. Women came seeking repairs to precious garments brought from their former lives. Men needed heavy winter clothing reinforced and waterproofed. Even Duncan requested her services, bringing her leather goods that needed expert stitching. It was honest work, valued work. And as Isabel sat by candlelight, her needle moving through fabric with the practiced precision her mother had taught her, she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Purpose, not just survival, but actual purpose. She was building something again, creating, contributing. Winter deepened around Fort Promise, and with it came a kind of peace. The snow fell heavy and frequent, sealing them away from the outside world. The trading post became an island of warmth and human connection in an ocean of frozen prairie. People gathered in the evenings to share stories, to trade news, to simply sit in companionable silence around communal fires. Isabel and Grey Eagle's relationship deepened during these months. The ceremonial marriage in the valley had been born of necessity and respect, but now something more was growing. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's needs. They discovered that they could make each other laugh, a revelation after so much hardship. They found comfort in small touches, in shared glances, in the simple knowledge that they were not alone. One evening, as they lay together in their narrow bed, the stove glowing warmly in the corner, Grey Eagle spoke into the darkness. "I have been thinking about Morning Star, about the promise I made to her spirit." Isabel tensed slightly, uncertain where this was leading. "I promised to find hope again, and I have, not in forgetting her. I will never forget her, but in allowing myself to love again, to build again, with you." Isabel turned to face him, seeing the vulnerability in his expression. "I love you," he said simply. "Not as I loved Morning Star. That was different, shaped by youth and innocence. I love you as a man who has walked through fire loves the person who walked beside him. I love you for your strength, your courage, your refusal to break, despite everything that tried to break you." The words settled over Isabel like a benediction. She reached up, touching his face gently. "I love you too," she whispered. "I don't know when it happened. Somewhere between the auction and here, fear transformed into trust, and trust into something deeper. You saved my life, yes. But more than that, you gave me back myself." They made love that night for the first time, and it was tender and genuine and utterly unlike the brutal expectations Isabel had feared on the auction platform. It was partnership made physical, the joining of two people who had earned each other through shared struggle and mutual respect. And afterward, holding each other in the warm darkness, Isabel felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. Spring came late to the Canadian prairie, but when it arrived, it transformed the landscape with stunning speed. Snow melted into rushing streams. Grass emerged in brilliant green waves. Wildflowers appeared seemingly overnight, painting the prairie in colors that hurt the eyes with their intensity. And with spring came new possibilities. Duncan approached them one morning with a proposition. "There's land available about 10 miles north of here. Good land near water with timber for building. The Mounties are encouraging settlement. Legitimate settlers who'll farm and trade and help establish British presence in the territory. I could put in a word for you, help you file a claim." Grey Eagle and Isabel looked at each other, and in that look, an entire conversation passed between them. They could stay at the post, continue their work, remain part of this community, or they could strike out again, build something of their own, create a homestead that would be theirs by right rather than by hiding. It was risk, but everything worth having involved risk. "We'll take it," Grey Eagle said. "The land. We'll build a home there." Duncan grinned, clearly pleased. "Good, you'll need help. Building a proper cabin requires more than 2 sets of hands. But folks here, they help each other. That's how we survive." Over the following months, with the help of Fort Promise's community, Isabel and Grey Eagle built their homestead. Not a hidden valley camp designed for survival and concealment, but a real home. A sturdy log cabin with a stone fireplace and real windows. A barn for animals. A workshop where Isabel could practice her trade. Fields cleared and planted with wheat and vegetables. It was backbreaking work, but joyful in a way Isabel had never experienced. Every log raised, every nail driven, every seed planted was an act of hope, an assertion that they would endure, that they would thrive, that they had earned their place in this new land. One evening, as the cabin neared completion, Isabel and Grey Eagle sat on the steps watching the sun set over their property. The sky blazed with color, and in the distance a herd of wild horses grazed peacefully. "Do you ever think about Fort Griffin?" Isabel asked quietly. "About that day on the platform?" Grey Eagle was silent for a long moment. "Yes," he finally said, "but not with regret. That day, it was the worst and best of my life. Worst because it showed me how cruel humanity can be. Best because it brought us together. Because it gave me you." Isabel leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the absolute certainty of his presence. "My mother used to say that God works in mysterious ways. I never understood what she meant until now. Everything that happened, the raid, the captivity, the auction, the flight north, all of it was terrible, but it led here to this. To us, perhaps, Grey Eagle said thoughtfully. Suffering only has meaning if we transform it into something better. We have taken our pain and used it to build love, to build home, to build future. That is the only redemption possible in this hard world. As summer deepened, the homestead flourished. The crops grew tall and green. Animals were purchased from Fort Promise. Chickens, goats, eventually a cow. Isabel's sewing work brought in steady income from traders and settlers throughout the region. Grey Eagle's hunting supplied not only their table, but also trade goods that could be exchanged for necessities. And one autumn morning, a year after their arrival at Fort Promise, Isabel woke with absolute certainty about something she had suspected for weeks. She was pregnant. The child she had desperately lied about on the auction platform, the promise made in terror, was now becoming reality. But this time it was chosen, wanted, loved already. When she told Grey Eagle, his reaction was everything she could have hoped. Joy, wonder, and yes, fear. The shadow of his loss with Morning Star still haunted him. But beneath the fear was hope, stronger and more resilient than the darkness. "We will face this together," he said, his hand resting gently on her still flat belly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." The child, a daughter they would name Hope, because what else could she be, was born the following spring. The birth was attended by women from Fort Promise, experienced midwives who had helped bring countless frontier babies into the world. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when Isabel understood viscerally what Morning Star had faced, what so many women faced in this hard land. But she survived. The baby survived, and when Grey Eagle held his daughter for the first time, tears streaming down his weathered face, Isabel saw the final pieces of his broken heart knit together, not forgetting Morning Star, never forgetting, but allowing new love to exist alongside old grief, creating something whole from what had been shattered. The years that followed were not easy. The frontier never promised ease. There were hard winters and failed crops, sickness and injury, moments when survival seemed uncertain. But through it all, Isabel and Grey Eagle endured. They raised their daughter to be strong, to be skilled, to be proud of both her heritages. They expanded their homestead, took in other refugees when needed, became pillars of the small but growing community, and sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the work was done, and hope was asleep and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Isabel would think back to that terrible day on the auction platform, to the moment when she had spoken her desperate lie, had caught the eye of a grieving stranger, had chosen survival over surrender. She would think about the journey that had brought her here, through captivity and fear, through violence and flight, through winter and hardship and doubt. And she would understand with profound clarity that every step had been necessary, that suffering, when transformed through courage and love, could become redemption. Grey Eagle would often join her in these quiet moments, as if sensing her thoughts. They would sit together in companionable silence, their hands intertwined, their daughter sleeping peacefully inside. Two people who should never have met, whose union defied every social convention and legal stricture of their time. Two people who had found each other in the worst possible circumstances and created something beautiful. "We made it," as Isabel would sometimes say, the words a talisman against the darkness they had traversed. And Grey Eagle would always respond the same way, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "We made it together, and together we will continue to endure." The frontier stretched endlessly around their homestead, vast and indifferent and unforgiving. But within their small circle of warmth and love and determined hope, they had created something that could withstand any storm. They had created home. Not the home that either had been born to, but the home they had earned through shared struggle and mutual sacrifice. And as the sun set on another day, painting the Canadian sky in colors that seemed to promise infinite possibility, Isabel Renaud, now Isabel Eagle, understood the final truth of her journey. That freedom was never given. It was taken that love was never guaranteed. It was built, and that redemption, true redemption, came not from erasing the past, but from transforming it into fuel for creating a better future. The story of a young woman on an auction platform and a grieving warrior with a leather pouch of gold had become the foundation of a legacy of resilience, of hope, of the indomitable human spirit that refuses to be broken no matter how hard the world tries. And in that legacy, in that endurance, lay the only victory that truly mattered. And that's where our story rides into the sunset. But the frontier never truly ends. If you enjoyed this journey through courage, love, and redemption, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more Western tales, and comment below where you're watching from. We'd love to know what part of the world your frontier begins. And don't ride off just yet. Check out these other cool stories waiting on your screen. Each one's got dust, danger, and a touch of heart. Until next time, keep your fire burning and your spirit free.